The small town of Echo Creek sat nestled between rolling hills and sprawling farmland, its peace undisturbed for decades. The heart of the town was a modest truck stop, a lifeline for travelers and locals alike. The diner, run by Marcy Bennett, was a gathering place where stories were shared over steaming cups of coffee and hearty meals. For Marcy, it was more than a business. It was her sanctuary, where she raised her young son, Cody, after losing her husband in a car accident years earlier. The quiet routine of Echo Creek was shattered late one Friday evening. A rumble of motorcycles echoed through the valley, growing louder as the Black Hornets, a notorious biker gang, rolled into town. Their arrival was marked by the screeching of brakes and the glaring headlights of their bikes as they parked in front of the diner. Inside, the warm hum of conversation stilled. Marcy, wiping down the counter, exchanged a nervous glance with her waitress, Jenny. Regulars like old Mr. Clarence, who came every night for his slice of pie, shifted uneasily in their seats. The gang's leader, a wiry man with a cold, calculating stare, pushed open the door. His leather jacket bore the emblem of a black hornet with a jagged stinger. He surveyed the room like a predator scanning its prey. "Evenin'," he drawled, his voice low and menacing. "Heard this was the place to stop for a meal and business." Marcy forced a polite smile, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the coffee pot. "What can I get for you?" The leader smirked, taking a seat at the counter. "How about everything? And let's make it on the house, sweetheart. Call it a courtesy for your new protectors." The other gang members laughed, spreading out through the diner. One knocked over a napkin dispenser. Another leaned over a table where an elderly couple sat, grinning wolfishly. In the back corner, Lucas Hayes sat quietly, sipping his coffee. A man in his early 40s with a rugged face and piercing blue eyes, Lucas had lived in Echo Creek for 2 years, running the mechanic shop just outside town. Though he kept to himself, those who knew him admired his quiet strength and dependability. Lucas placed his mug on the table and stood, his movements deliberate. He stepped forward, his boots clicking softly on the tiled floor. "You're making a lot of noise for people who just want a meal," Lucas said evenly, his voice carrying an edge of authority that made the room fall silent. The gang leader turned, narrowing his eyes at Lucas. "And who might you be?" "Just someone who likes his coffee without a side of trouble," Lucas replied, his gaze steady. The leader smirked but didn't reply. He motioned for his men to back off, then rose to his feet, brushing past Lucas as he headed for the door. "We'll be back," he said over his shoulder. "This place, and this town, might need a little lesson in manners." The roar of their engines faded into the night, leaving a tense silence in their wake. Marcy let out a shaky breath, her hands clutching the counter for support. "Lucas, you didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "They'll be back, but we'll be ready." Sheriff Greg Marshall arrived soon after, having heard about the commotion. A middle-aged man with a weathered face, Greg was known for being fair but was limited by his small-town resources. He listened to Marcy's account and Lucas's observations, his expression growing grim. "They're not just passing through," Greg said. "The Black Hornets are tied to a larger network running drugs through towns like ours. If they're here, it's because they've decided to set up shop." Lucas nodded, his mind already working. "Then we make it clear they've chosen the wrong town." As Greg left to patrol the roads, Lucas returned to his booth, his coffee now cold. He stared out the window into the darkness, his reflection superimposed against the quiet street. He had come to Echo Creek seeking peace, but he knew peace often came with a price. The Black Hornets thought they had found an easy target. They were wrong. The morning after the Black Hornets' visit to Echo Creek dawned quiet and cool, with a crispness in the air that signaled autumn's approach. But the tension from the previous night lingered like a storm cloud over the town. Marcy Bennett stood outside her diner, staring at the spray-painted graffiti scrawled across the building's side. The words, "Black Hornets run this town," dripped ominously in black paint. Broken glass from a shattered window crunched underfoot as she bent to pick up the fragments. Her son, Cody, peeked out from the diner's doorway. "Are they going to come back, Mom?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. Marcy forced a smile and walked over to him, kneeling down to his level. Don't worry, sweetheart. We'll take care of this. She ruffled his hair, though her own heart was heavy with worry. Inside, the breakfast rush continued as usual, customers speaking in hushed tones about the gang's threats. Not far away, at his mechanic shop, Lucas Hayes was already at work. He wiped his hands on a grease-stained rag and stepped out into the lot when he heard a truck approach. Doug Stanton, his old friend and war buddy, climbed out of the cab. Doug was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with a no-nonsense demeanor and an easy grin that rarely left his face. "Got your message," Doug said, shaking Lucas's hand. "Heard you've got a biker problem." "More than a problem," Lucas replied. "They're not just here to make trouble, they're planning to take over." Doug frowned, glancing around the shop's perimeter. "So what's the plan?" Lucas nodded toward the back of the shop, where he'd set up a makeshift operations center. A folding table with a laptop, maps, and notes pinned to a corkboard. "We start with information. If we're going to protect the town, we need to know everything about them. How they move, what they want, and who's behind them." As the two men strategized, Sheriff Greg Marshall arrived. His patrol car pulled up in a cloud of dust, and he stepped out, his face lined with concern. "Morning, Lucas." "Doug," he greeted them. "I just came from Marcy's diner. It's not looking good." "I saw the graffiti," Lucas said. "It's intimidation, plain and simple. They want people scared." Greg sighed, leaning against the patrol car. "It's working. I've been fielding calls all morning from business owners. They're terrified, and I can't blame them. My department's got 3 deputies and 1 working patrol car. We're stretched thin. That's why we need to handle this differently," Lucas said. "You focus on keeping the peace. Let us gather the intel and protect the businesses." Greg raised an eyebrow. "And by US, you mean?" "Doug and me, for starters. There's also Marcy. She's sharp with tech. If we can install cameras and motion detectors around town, we'll at least have eyes on their movements." The sheriff rubbed his chin, clearly torn. "I'm not thrilled about civilians taking this on, Lucas, but I don't have a better option. Just keep it legal. No vigilante nonsense." Lucas nodded. "You have my word." Later that day, Lucas and Doug visited Marcy at the diner. She was standing on a ladder, scrubbing away at the graffiti with a determined expression. When she saw them, she climbed down, wiping her hands on her apron. "Here to order lunch or save the day?" she asked, her tone light despite the situation. "Both," Doug replied with a grin. "Lucas says you're good with tech. We could use some help setting up surveillance." Marcy hesitated. "You're serious about this? I'm not exactly a crime fighter." "Neither are we," Lucas said. "We're just trying to keep the town safe." She considered this for a moment before nodding. "Okay, I've got some old cameras from when I tried to upgrade the diner's security system. They're not fancy, but they'll do the job." By nightfall, the group had installed cameras around key areas: the diner, the mechanic shop, and the town's main road. Doug even volunteered to park his truck near the entrance to Echo Creek, serving as both a deterrent and an extra set of eyes. The first footage came in just after midnight. A group of bikers was spotted circling the diner, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. One of them spray-painted another message: "This is just the beginning." The next morning, Lucas and Doug reviewed the footage with Sheriff Marshall. "They're testing us," Lucas said, "seeing how far they can push." Greg frowned. "What do you suggest?" "We keep gathering evidence," Lucas replied. "Let them think they're in control while we prepare." The sheriff nodded reluctantly. "But if they escalate, we'll need backup. I'll start reaching out to the state police, see if they can send reinforcements." As the days passed, Lucas's plan began to take shape. Marcy worked tirelessly to monitor the camera feeds, while Doug coordinated with truckers passing through town, many of whom volunteered to keep an eye on suspicious activity. Word spread among the locals, and soon others stepped forward to help. Henry, the elderly owner of the hardware store, donated supplies for building barricades. Jenny, the waitress, started taking notes on the gang's comings and goings. The Black Hornets might have thought they were instilling fear, but they were doing something else entirely. They were bringing the town together. The morning sky over Echo Creek was gray and overcast, a fitting backdrop to the growing unease in the town. The Black Hornets had escalated their campaign of intimidation. Word spread quickly. Supply trucks bound for the diner, the mechanic shop, and even the local grocery store were being stopped on the highway, their drivers harassed or turned back. Roads leading into town were lined with bikers, their presence a constant reminder of the gang's looming threat. At Marcy's diner, the usual hum of conversation was subdued. The regulars spoke in whispers, their gazes darting toward the windows. Marcy worked behind the counter, her face calm but her movements tense. Cody sat in a corner booth, sketching quietly, though his eyes occasionally flicked to the door. Lucas Hayes entered, his boots heavy on the floor. He walked over to Marcy, nodding a quiet hello before taking a seat at the counter. "Anything new?" he asked. Marcy placed a steaming mug of coffee in front of him. More trucks were stopped last night. The grocery delivery didn't make it, and Jenny said her brother's truck was turned around by some of those bikers. They threatened to slash his tires if he tried again. Lucas took a sip of coffee, his eyes narrowing. "They're trying to choke us out. If they control the roads, they think they control us." Sheriff Greg Marshall entered the diner, his face set in a grim line. He joined Lucas at the counter, lowering his voice. "I just came from talking to Pete over at the gas station. A few of the Hornets stopped by last night, told him to double the price of fuel and hand over half the profits, or they'd burn the place down." "They're getting bolder," Lucas said, "which means they're overconfident. That's something we can use." The sheriff frowned. "Lucas, we're outnumbered. I've got 3 deputies, and the state police can't send help for at least another week. We can't afford a direct confrontation." "I'm not suggesting a fight," Lucas said calmly. "We need to be smarter. Use what we have." Marcy leaned in, her voice quiet but firm. "What's the plan?" Lucas set his coffee down and turned to her and Greg. "First, we map out their movements. Figure out where they're stationed and when. Doug and the truckers can help with that. Second, we start working on alternative routes, old service roads, farm trails, any way to get supplies in without going through the main highways. Third, we keep documenting everything they do. The more evidence we gather, the stronger our case when the state police and feds step in." Greg sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's risky, but it might be our only shot. I'll reach out to some of the farmers about those back roads. They might not like the Hornets, but they're wary of stirring up trouble." "I'll talk to them," Lucas said. "They'll listen if they know we're organized." By afternoon, Lucas and Doug were driving out to the outskirts of town, checking old maps and scouting forgotten roads. They stopped at a farm owned by the Connolly family, whose land stretched for miles around Echo Creek. Mr. Connolly, a grizzled man in his 60s, greeted them at the gate. "Lucas Hayes," he said, shaking his hand. "Haven't seen you since you fixed my tractor last fall. What brings you out here?" "We're looking for a way to bypass the highways," Lucas explained. "The Black Hornets are blocking supply routes into town, and we need to keep things moving." Connolly scowled. "Those thugs stopped one of my hay deliveries last week. Told my driver he'd be paying taxes if he wanted to use the highway again." Lucas nodded. "Then you understand why we need this. If you let us use the trails through your land, we can outmaneuver them. Doug can guide the trucks in, and we'll keep it quiet." After a moment's thought, Connolly nodded. "You've got my permission. Just keep the bikers off my property." Back in town, Marcy was busy monitoring the camera feeds. She'd set up a makeshift command center in the diner's back office, where a laptop displayed live footage from around Echo Creek. "Lucas," she called over the radio as he and Doug drove back. "I've been listening in on some of their radio chatter. They're talking about a shipment coming through in the next few days. Sounds big." Lucas exchanged a glance with Doug. "Drugs?" "Probably," Marcy replied, "but they're careful not to say too much. Whatever it is, it's important enough that they're doubling their numbers." By nightfall, Lucas called a meeting at the diner. Sheriff Marshall, Marcy, Doug, and a few trusted locals gathered in the dining area, the blinds drawn tight. "We've got a critical window," Lucas began, pointing to a map spread across the counter. "The Hornets are planning something big. If we can figure out what it is and where it's happening, we can use that information to shut them down." Doug tapped the map. "We've got the back roads ready. I'll guide the supply trucks in tomorrow night. That'll buy us time, but we'll need to stay ahead of the bikers." Sheriff Marshall added, I've reached out to the state police. They've agreed to fast-track reinforcements if we can give them hard evidence of what the Hornets are doing. That's where Marcy comes in, Lucas said. She's already picked up chatter about a shipment. We need to keep monitoring them and figure out exactly when and where it's happening. The group nodded in agreement, their determination growing despite the odds. As the meeting ended, Marcy pulled Lucas aside. What if they figure out what we're doing? Won't they come after us harder? They might, Lucas admitted. But fear only works if we let it. Right now, they think they're in control. We'll keep it that way, until it's too late for them to stop us. Outside, the sound of motorcycles echoed in the distance, a reminder of the danger that loomed. But Lucas and the people of Echo Creek were no longer passive observers. They were ready to fight back, not with violence, but with unity, strategy, and resolve. The Black Hornets thought they could tighten their grip on the town. Instead, they were unknowingly setting the stage for their own downfall. The tension in Echo Creek had reached a boiling point. For days, the Black Hornets had continued their campaign of intimidation, blocking roads, harassing business owners, and leaving threatening graffiti across town. Yet Lucas Hayes and his growing network of allies refused to back down. Quietly, they worked to turn the tide, using strategy and unity to counter the gang's growing aggression. Late one evening, Marcy Bennett sat in her diner's back office, headphones on as she monitored intercepted radio chatter from the bikers. A wave of static gave way to muffled voices. They're still resisting, one voice said. We hit them harder tomorrow night. Start with the truck stop. Marcy's stomach tightened as she grabbed her radio. Lucas, you there? Across town, Lucas was in his shop, reviewing maps and notes with Doug Stanton. He picked up the radio. Go ahead. They're planning something big tomorrow night, Marcy said. The truck stop's their target. Sounds like they want to take control of it completely. Lucas exchanged a glance with Doug. If they take the truck stop, they'll have a chokehold on the town, he said grimly. Doug nodded. They'll use it as a base for their shipments. We can't let that happen. We won't, Lucas said firmly. Marcy, keep monitoring them. Doug, get the others. We need everyone ready by tomorrow night. The next day, Lucas and Doug worked tirelessly to prepare. They reinforced the truck stop with makeshift barricades, using piles of old tires and scrap metal to block potential entry points. Henry, the hardware store owner, donated floodlights to illuminate the area. At the diner, Marcy coordinated efforts from her command center, keeping a close eye on the camera feeds. Sheriff Greg Marshall, though outnumbered, patrolled the streets to maintain a visible presence and reassure the townspeople. By sundown, the defenders were in position. Doug stationed his truck near the truck stop's entrance, acting as both a blockade and a lookout. Henry and a few other locals stood guard at key points, armed with radios and non-lethal tools like flashlights and fire extinguishers. Inside the truck stop, Lucas gave a final briefing to the group. Remember, we're not here to fight. We're here to protect. Stay calm, stay focused, and stick to the plan. As darkness fell, the roar of motorcycles filled the air. The Black Hornets arrived in force, their headlights cutting through the night. Blade, the gang's leader, led the charge, his cold eyes scanning the truck stop as his men dismounted. Lucas and Doug stood at the front, calm and resolute. This ends tonight, Blade called out, his voice carrying across the lot. You think you can defy us? We own this town now. You don't own anything, Lucas replied evenly. And you're not taking this truck stop. Blade smirked, gesturing for his men to advance. We'll see about that. The bikers spread out, approaching the barricades. One swung a chain at the tires, trying to force an opening, but Doug was ready. With a flick of a switch, the floodlights blazed to life, momentarily blinding the attackers. Hold your ground, Lucas called to his team. The bikers hesitated, their advantage of darkness stolen. Lucas and his team used the confusion to their benefit. Henry turned on a smoke machine from the hardware store, obscuring the bikers' vision further. Blade, furious, shouted orders. Push through. Tear it all down. One biker tried to climb over the barricade, but Doug sprayed him with a fire extinguisher, forcing him back. Another attempted to breach the side entrance, only to trip a makeshift alarm rigged with pots and pans, alerting Lucas to the intrusion. From her station at the diner, Marcy kept the team informed. 2 more are circling toward the west side, she reported. Lucas moved quickly, intercepting the bikers before they could flank the defenders. His movements were efficient and deliberate, honed by years of military training. He disarmed one attacker with ease, forcing the man to retreat. As the standoff dragged on, Blade realized his men were losing momentum. He stepped forward, brandishing a crowbar. "You think you're smart, Hayes? Let's see how tough you really are." Lucas stood his ground, meeting Blade's glare. "Walk away, Blade. You don't win here." Blade snarled and charged, but Lucas sidestepped him with precision, using Blade's momentum against him. The gang leader stumbled, his crowbar clattering to the ground. Before Blade could recover, the wail of sirens echoed in the distance. Sheriff Marshall arrived with backup, 2 state police cars that had finally reached the town. The bikers froze, their confidence evaporating. Blade cursed under his breath as the officers surrounded the group. "It's over," Marshall said, stepping forward. "Drop your weapons." Most of the bikers complied, raising their hands in surrender. Blade, however, refused to yield. "You haven't seen the last of us," he spat, glaring at Lucas. "Maybe not," Lucas replied calmly, "but you won't be back here." As the police rounded up the gang, Lucas's team began dismantling the barricades. The truck stop was safe, and the town had won its first major victory. Later that night, Lucas and Marcy sat on the diner's porch, watching the first hints of dawn break over the horizon. "Do you think they'll come back?" Marcy asked, her voice soft. "They'll try," Lucas admitted. "But now they know we're ready." Marcy smiled faintly. "You know, for someone who just wanted a quiet life, you're not very good at staying out of trouble." Lucas chuckled. "Trouble has a way of finding me, but I don't mind, as long as it's worth it." As the sun rose over Echo Creek, the town felt a glimmer of hope. The Black Hornets had underestimated their resolve, and for the first time, the people of Echo Creek believed they could take back their town. The aftermath of the truck stop defense brought both relief and urgency to Echo Creek. The Black Hornets had been driven back, but the fight was far from over. Blade and his remaining crew were still at large, and their radio chatter, intercepted by Marcy, suggested they were regrouping for something bigger. "They're furious," Marcy said as she listened to another fragmented transmission. "Blade's planning to hit us hard, maybe even bring in reinforcements from their parent group." Lucas Hayes stood beside her in the diner's back office, his eyes scanning a map spread across the desk. "They're desperate. They've already lost credibility with their crew, and now they're trying to salvage what's left. That means they'll overcommit." Sheriff Greg Marshall, who had joined them, crossed his arms. "Overcommit to what, exactly?" "To making an example of us," Lucas replied. "If they can crush Echo Creek, it'll send a message to the rest of the region. But they're not thinking clearly, they're angry. That's an advantage we can use." Doug Stanton entered, his truck keys jingling in his hand. "The truckers I've talked to are keeping their ears open. Word is, Blade's bringing in at least a dozen more bikers by the end of the week. They're planning something big, bigger than just intimidation," Marcy added. "I caught a snippet about a shipment. Drugs, most likely." Lucas nodded. "It's not just about us, then. If we can confirm the shipment's details, we can get the state police and federal agents involved. We need to make this their last move." "Which means setting the right trap," Marshall said. Lucas leaned over the map, pointing to key locations. "First, we make them think we're vulnerable. Pull back some of our defenses, give them a reason to think we're scared. Then we guide them right where we want them." Doug grinned. "And where's that?" "The industrial yard outside town," Lucas said. "It's isolated, with plenty of cover for us to work with. If we make it look like we're storing something valuable there, they'll bite." "That's risky," Marshall said. "So is doing nothing," Lucas replied. "We'll coordinate with the state police. By the time Blade realizes what's happening, he'll have walked his entire crew into a trap they can't escape." For the next few days, Lucas and his team worked tirelessly to prepare. Doug used his truck to deliver crates to the industrial yard. Empty crates, but ones that would look like they contained something worth stealing. Marcy spread disinformation through the intercepted radio channels, dropping hints about a shipment being stored in the yard. Meanwhile, Sheriff Marshall contacted the state police and secured their support. "We'll need them to stay hidden until the last possible moment," Lucas instructed. "The bikers can't suspect anything until it's too late." The townspeople played their part as well. Henry from the hardware store helped rig the industrial yard with motion sensors and hidden cameras, ensuring every angle was covered. Jenny, the waitress, volunteered to take notes on anything suspicious she overheard at the diner. On the evening of the planned attack, the air was thick with anticipation. Lucas and Doug stood in the industrial yard, going over the final details. The floodlights had been rigged to blind the bikers once they entered, and barricades had been strategically placed to funnel them into a tight space. "This'll work," Doug said, his voice steady. "But only if they take the bait." "They will," Lucas said. Blade's pride won't let him back down. Marcy's voice came over the radio. "They're moving. 15 bikes heading your way, with a van following behind." "Reinforcements," Lucas muttered. "They're bringing muscle to secure the shipment." Sheriff Marshall's voice cut in. "State police are in position. Just give the signal." "Hold tight," Lucas said. "Let them come to us." The sound of motorcycles shattered the stillness of the night. The Black Hornets roared into the industrial yard, their headlights sweeping across the empty crates. Blade dismounted his bike, barking orders at his crew. "Search the crates. Find whatever they're hiding," he yelled. The bikers spread out, prying open crates and finding nothing but empty boxes. Confusion rippled through their ranks. "What is this?" one of them muttered. Blade's face twisted in anger. "It's a setup," he shouted. "They're messing with us." At that moment, Lucas activated the floodlights. The yard blazed with blinding light, and the bikers stumbled back, shielding their eyes. "Now!" Lucas shouted into his radio. From all sides, state police vehicles surged forward, their sirens piercing the night. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, surrounding the gang. Blade cursed, pulling a gun, but Lucas stepped forward, unarmed. "Don't," Lucas said, his voice calm but commanding. "It's over, Blade. Put it down." Blade hesitated, his hand trembling. Around him, his crew began to surrender, dropping their weapons as the police closed in. "You think this is over?" Blade spat. "You don't know what you've started." Lucas stepped closer, his gaze steady. "I know exactly what I've started, and it ends here." Blade's defiance faltered, and he finally dropped the gun. As the police rounded up the gang, Marcy and Sheriff Marshall arrived at the scene. Marcy hugged Lucas tightly, relief evident in her eyes. "You did it," she said. "We all did," Lucas replied. Marshall surveyed the arrests being made. "What about the shipment?" "Marcy," Lucas said, nodding to her. She held up her phone, showing intercepted messages. "I've got the coordinates. The shipment's being stored in a warehouse 2 towns over. State police are already en route." Marshall smiled. "You've given us more than a victory tonight, Lucas. You've given us the tools to take down the whole operation." As the bikers were loaded into police vans, the people of Echo Creek began to gather, drawn by the commotion. For the first time in weeks, the town felt a sense of safety. Doug clapped Lucas on the back. "Not bad for a quiet town." Lucas allowed himself a small smile. "Let's hope it stays that way." But he knew there was more work to be done. The fight against the Black Hornets had reached a turning point, but the larger network behind them was still out there. For now, though, Echo Creek had proven one thing. When a community stands together, even the strongest threats can be defeated. The arrests of the Black Hornets brought a wave of relief to Echo Creek. For the first time in weeks, the streets felt safe again. Businesses reopened without fear, and supply trucks returned to their regular routes. Yet, Lucas Hayes and Sheriff Greg Marshall knew the fight was far from over. At the diner, Marcy Bennett sat in the back office, scrolling through the camera feeds from the industrial yard. "Blade wasn't bluffing," she said, pointing to a time-stamped clip of the gang leader shouting as he was taken into custody. "He said this isn't over, and I believe him." Lucas leaned over her shoulder, studying the footage. "It's not," he agreed. "The Hornets are just one piece of a larger operation. If Blade was moving drugs, someone higher up is going to notice that their shipment didn't make it." Sheriff Marshall, standing nearby, nodded grimly. The state police intercepted that shipment and found over $5 million worth of narcotics. Whoever's backing the Hornets won't take that loss lightly. Doug Stanton entered, holding a stack of papers. I talked to a few of the truckers who've been running this route for years. They say the Hornets have ties to a bigger group, a cartel based out of the southern border. These guys don't just shrug off setbacks. Then we need to make sure they can't regroup, Lucas said. If the cartel steps in, we'll be outnumbered and outgunned. But if we hit them before they have a chance to retaliate, we can shut this down for good. The next day, Sheriff Marshall received an unexpected visitor at his office. A man in a suit introduced himself as Agent Eric Cole from the DEA. With sharp eyes and a firm handshake, Cole wasted no time getting to the point. "We've been watching the Black Hornets for months," Cole said, setting a folder on Marshall's desk. "They've been smuggling drugs and laundering money for the Los Reyes cartel. Your town's takedown of their gang has disrupted a major distribution hub." Marshall flipped through the folder, which contained photos, maps, and reports. "So what happens now?" Cole leaned back in his chair. "The cartel will try to re-establish control. They'll send enforcers to deal with your town and anyone they see as a threat. That's where we come in. With your help, we can set up a sting operation to bring them down." Marshall hesitated. "This town's been through enough. We can't risk civilians getting caught in the crossfire." Cole nodded. "Understood. We'll keep the operation contained, but we need intel from people who know the terrain and who've already proven they can stand up to these guys." Later that afternoon, Marshall gathered Lucas, Doug, and Marcy at the diner to relay the DEA's plan. "They want to use Echo Creek as bait," Marshall said bluntly. "Make it look like we're still vulnerable, so the cartel sends their enforcers. Once they show up, we spring the trap." Doug crossed his arms. "And what happens if the trap fails? We're just a bunch of locals, Greg. We're not trained for this." Lucas spoke up, his tone calm but resolute. "We don't need to fight them head-on. The DEA has the resources to handle this, but they'll need us to guide them. We know this town better than anyone. If we play this smart, we can pull it off." Marcy tapped her laptop. "I've already been monitoring their communications. If the cartel's moving in, I can track them before they get too close." Marshall sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't like it, but I don't see another option. If we let the cartel regroup, we're looking at years of violence, not weeks." The sting operation began with subtle changes in the town's routine. The industrial yard was left seemingly abandoned, with its cameras hidden and motion sensors armed. Doug parked his truck conspicuously near the diner, making it look like shipments were flowing again. Meanwhile, Marcy monitored intercepted messages from cartel operatives. Over several days, a pattern emerged. The cartel wasn't just planning retaliation, they were organizing a takeover. "They're sending someone called El Silencio," Marcy reported one evening. "Apparently, he's their fixer. If he's involved, it means they're not just sending muscle, they're sending someone to clean house." "Then we need to make sure this guy doesn't succeed," Lucas said. 1 week later, Echo Creek braced for what felt like a storm. Marcy caught a message confirming that El Silencio and his team were en route. Agent Cole and a DEA tactical team arrived under the cover of darkness, setting up a command center in an unused storage building near the truck stop. Lucas, Doug, and Sheriff Marshall joined them for a final briefing. Cole laid out the plan, pointing to a map of the town. El Silencio's team will likely approach from 2 directions, the main highway and the service road near the industrial yard. We'll let them get into position before we block their escape routes. Lucas, your team will act as eyes on the ground. Once we have confirmation of their location, we move in." Doug raised an eyebrow. "And if they start shooting?" "We'll handle it," Cole said firmly. As night fell, the town seemed eerily quiet. Lucas and Doug waited in the diner's parking lot, their radios crackling with updates. Marcy sat at her station, watching the camera feeds with a mix of focus and anxiety. "They're here," she said, her voice steady despite the tension. 2 SUVs and 3 bikes on the highway. Another car coming down the service road. "Copy that," Lucas replied. "Doug, stay close. Marshall, keep your patrol car visible. It'll make them overconfident." The cartel vehicles rolled into town, their occupants stepping out cautiously. El Silencio, a tall man with a cold expression and a scar running down his cheek, surveyed the area. His men spread out, their movements precise and calculated. "Wait for it," Cole's voice came over the radio. Lucas watched from his vantage point behind a parked truck. He could see the tension in El Silencio's stance, the way his men glanced nervously at the empty streets. "They're spooked," Lucas whispered to Doug. "That's because they don't know what's coming," Doug replied with a smirk. The moment came when El Silencio signaled for his men to move toward the industrial yard. Cole gave the order. "Go." Floodlights snapped on, and DEA agents emerged from their hiding spots. The cartel enforcers froze, caught off guard by the sudden show of force. "Hands up. Now," an agent shouted. El Silencio hesitated for a split second before reaching for his weapon, but Lucas was faster. From his position, he aimed and fired a beanbag round, hitting the fixer square in the chest and knocking him to the ground. The cartel enforcers, seeing their leader incapacitated, quickly surrendered. Within minutes, the operation was over. As the DEA team secured the cartel members, Cole approached Lucas, his expression one of respect. "You and your team did good tonight," Cole said. "We did what we had to," Lucas replied. The people of Echo Creek gathered cautiously as the scene unfolded, their fear replaced by a growing sense of hope. For the first time, it seemed the cartel's shadow over their town was lifting. But Lucas knew better than to celebrate too soon. This victory was only one battle in a larger war. The arrest of El Silencio and his team sent shockwaves through the Los Reyes cartel. For years, their operations had run with near impunity, relying on fear and precision to maintain control. But now, the quiet town of Echo Creek had become a symbol of resistance. The cartel's leadership wasn't about to let that stand. In a hidden estate far from Echo Creek, cartel leader Javier Ortega sat in his sprawling study, listening to a report from one of his lieutenants. Ortega was a calculating man in his 50s, with silver-streaked hair and piercing eyes that betrayed no emotion. "El Silencio has been captured," the lieutenant said, his voice cautious. "And with him, several key operatives. The shipment was seized, and their operation in Echo Creek is effectively dismantled." Ortega's expression didn't change. He steepled his fingers and leaned forward. "And the locals? How did they manage this?" "It appears the town organized against us. They had outside help, state police, a DEA task force. But the locals were instrumental in exposing our movements." Ortega nodded slowly, his mind working through the implications. "If one town can stand against us, others will think they can do the same. We cannot allow this." "What are your orders?" "Send a message," Ortega said coldly. "Ensure Echo Creek understands the price of defiance." Back in Echo Creek, life seemed to be returning to normal. With the Black Hornets dismantled and El Silencio's team in custody, the town was no longer under immediate threat. Businesses reopened, and people walked the streets with a renewed sense of security. At Marcy's Diner, Lucas Hayes sat with Sheriff Greg Marshall and Doug Stanton, discussing the aftermath of the sting operation. "The DEA's been digging through the intel we gathered," Marshall said. "Turns out, the shipment wasn't just a one-off. Echo Creek was supposed to be a permanent hub for the cartel's operations in this region." Doug whistled. "Well, we threw a wrench in that plan." Lucas nodded. "But that also means they won't just walk away. The cartel's too big, too proud. They'll come back, and when they do, it won't be subtle." Marcy joined them, holding a pot of coffee. "I've been keeping an eye on the feeds. Nothing yet, but if Ortega's as ruthless as they say, he won't let this go." "Then we need to prepare," Lucas said. "This town's proven it can stand together. Now we need to make sure we're ready for whatever they send next." That evening, Lucas met with a group of trusted locals at the community center. Farmers, truckers, shop owners, and volunteers from all walks of life filled the room, their faces serious. Lucas stood at the front, addressing the group. "We've done a lot already. We took down the Black Hornets, exposed the cartel's operation, and worked with the DEA to arrest their enforcers. But this isn't over. The cartel isn't going to back down quietly. If they come for us again, we need to be ready." Henry, the hardware store owner, raised his hand. "What kind of retaliation are we talking about?" "Anything," Lucas said bluntly. "Sabotage, intimidation, even violence. We need to keep documenting everything, just like we did with the bikers. Every threat, every suspicious movement. It all needs to be reported and logged. Jenny, the waitress, spoke up. What about the state police and the feds? Will they help us again? They will, Sheriff Marshall assured her. But they can't always be here. That's why it's up to us to hold the line. The group nodded, their resolve clear. The cartel's retaliation began subtly. Marcy was the first to notice the signs. A black SUV parked on the edge of town, its occupants watching the diner for hours before driving off. Reports of strangers asking questions about Lucas, Sheriff Marshall, and other key figures began trickling in. A week later, the retaliation escalated. Henry's hardware store was broken into, its shelves ransacked. A fire broke out at the edge of Connolly's farm, destroying part of his crop. They're trying to scare us, Lucas said, standing with Doug outside the charred remains of the barn. But it's more than that. They're testing us, looking for weaknesses. They're not going to find any, Doug said firmly. The people of Echo Creek rallied once more. Lucas worked with Marcy to expand the surveillance network, adding new cameras and motion sensors around key areas of town. Doug coordinated with truckers to set up a communication network, ensuring that any suspicious activity on the roads was immediately reported. Sheriff Marshall organized patrols, enlisting volunteers to keep watch at night. If they're going to try something, we'll see it coming, he said. Late one night, Marcy intercepted a critical transmission. She burst into the diner, where Lucas and Doug were poring over maps. They're moving, she said, her voice urgent. A group of enforcers is heading this way, 6 vehicles armed. They're planning to hit the industrial yard and the diner. Lucas exchanged a look with Doug. This is it. He grabbed the radio. Sheriff, get your team ready. Marcy, alert the DEA. Doug, gather the volunteers. It's time to show them Echo Creek isn't an easy target. When the cartel enforcers arrived, they found the town dark and seemingly deserted. But Lucas and his team were ready. From their hidden vantage points, they watched as the SUVs rolled into the industrial yard. The first vehicle triggered a motion sensor, setting off a chain reaction of floodlights and alarms. Blinded and disoriented, the enforcers scrambled for cover. Lucas gave the signal, and the defenders sprang into action. Sheriff Marshall and his deputies blocked the exits, while Doug's team used fire extinguishers and smoke bombs to confuse the attackers further. The cartel enforcers, outnumbered and unprepared for the town's defenses, quickly realized they were at a disadvantage. Lucas stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. You don't belong here. Tell Ortega Echo Creek isn't his to take. The enforcers hesitated, their leader weighing his options. Finally, he gave the order to retreat. As the SUVs sped out of town, Marcy's voice came over the radio. DEA's moving in. They'll intercept them before they get far. Doug grinned. Looks like we just sent Ortega a message of our own. Lucas nodded, though his expression remained serious. This isn't the end. But tonight, we showed them what happens when they underestimate us. The people of Echo Creek gathered at the diner as dawn broke, their spirits high despite the long night. They had faced the cartel's retaliation and stood strong once again. But Lucas knew the fight wasn't over. Ortega wouldn't stop until he reclaimed control, or until the town dismantled his entire operation. Word of Echo Creek's continued resistance spread far beyond the town's borders. The successful repulsion of the cartel's enforcers emboldened other communities to take a stand, but it also drew the full attention of Javier Ortega. For the cartel leader, Echo Creek had become more than a thorn in his side. It was a symbol of defiance that needed to be eradicated. In his secluded mansion, Ortega convened a meeting with his top lieutenants. Maps, photos, and intercepted communications from Echo Creek were spread across the table. Ortega's voice was calm, but his eyes burned with intensity. Every attempt we've made to crush this town has failed, he said. They've embarrassed us, disrupted our operations, and inspired others to resist. This ends now. We will dismantle their defenses, destroy their network, and remind everyone who truly holds the power. In Echo Creek, the townspeople prepared for the storm they knew was coming. Lucas Hayes, Sheriff Greg Marshall, and Marcy Bennett worked around the clock to bolster their defenses and coordinate with the DEA. They're going to throw everything they have at us, Lucas said during a meeting at the diner. This won't just be enforcers or scare tactics. They'll come with full force. But if we can hold them off one last time, we'll have everything we need to bring down Ortega himself." Doug Stanton leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "And how do we do that? They've got numbers, firepower, and resources we can't match." Marcy tapped her laptop. "We use their size against them. The bigger their operation, the more mistakes they'll make. I've been monitoring their communications. Ortega's obsessed with making an example of us. He's rushing his plans, which means he's going to slip up." Sheriff Marshall nodded. "And when he does, we'll be ready." The plan was twofold. First, they would create the illusion of vulnerability, drawing Ortega's forces into a trap. Second, they would gather irrefutable evidence to dismantle the cartel's entire operation. Doug and the truckers staged mock deliveries to the industrial yard, spreading rumors about a new shipment moving through town. Marcy intercepted cartel communications and fed false intelligence about weakened defenses. Meanwhile, Lucas and his team worked with the DEA to position agents and state police units around key locations. As the trap was set, Lucas spoke to the townspeople gathered at the community center. "This town has been through hell, but we've shown that we're stronger together. Tonight, we take the fight to them, not just for Echo Creek, but for every community that's lived in fear of the cartel. Let's finish this." Ortega's forces arrived under the cover of darkness, 3 convoys of SUVs and motorcycles, along with heavily armed enforcers. Ortega himself remained at a distance, monitoring the operation through a secure feed. "They won't see it coming," one of his lieutenants assured him, but Echo Creek was ready. As the convoy moved into town, they triggered the first line of traps. Spike strips deployed across the roads disabled the lead vehicles, forcing the convoy to slow down. Floodlights and sirens blared, throwing the attackers into chaos. At the industrial yard, Lucas and Doug led a team of defenders, using makeshift barricades and smoke bombs to disorient the enforcers. From a hidden vantage point, Marcy coordinated the operation, relaying real-time updates to the DEA and state police. "They're splitting into 2 groups," Marcy reported. "One's heading toward the diner, the other toward the industrial yard." Sheriff Marshall intercepted the group near the diner, his deputies and federal agents blocking their advance. "This is as far as you go," he said, stepping forward with his badge displayed. The enforcers hesitated, realizing they were surrounded. At the industrial yard, the battle reached a fever pitch. Lucas moved with precision, using his military training to neutralize threats without escalating violence. Doug held the line with the other truckers, using their vehicles as mobile shields. In the chaos, one of Ortega's lieutenants was captured by the DEA. Under interrogation, he revealed critical information about the cartel's operations, including the location of Ortega's base and the identities of several corrupt officials on his payroll. Marcy relayed the intel to Lucas. "We've got what we need." The DEA's moving to raid Ortega's compound. Lucas nodded, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Good. Let's end this." As the cartel's forces retreated, Ortega watched the disaster unfold on his monitors. His lieutenants pleaded for orders, but the cartel leader knew it was too late. Echo Creek had outmaneuvered him at every turn. "This isn't over," Ortega growled. But deep down, he knew the cartel's grip on the region had been broken. The next morning, federal agents stormed Ortega's compound, arresting him and his remaining lieutenants. The evidence gathered from Echo Creek was instrumental in dismantling the cartel's network across multiple states. In the weeks that followed, the town became a symbol of resistance and resilience. News outlets covered the story of how a small community stood up to one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country. At the diner, Lucas, Marcy, Doug, and Sheriff Marshall sat together, reflecting on what they had achieved. "We did it," Marcy said, her voice filled with relief. Lucas nodded. "We did. But it wasn't just us. It was everyone in this town, standing together." Doug raised his coffee mug. "To Echo Creek." To Echo Creek, they echoed, their spirits high. Months later, life in Echo Creek returned to normal. But the impact of their stand was felt far and wide. Other communities adopted their strategies, building networks of resistance to protect themselves from similar threats. At his usual spot in the diner, Lucas watched the sunrise with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He knew there would always be new challenges, but Echo Creek had proven something important, that even the smallest towns could stand up to the greatest threats when people worked together. And that was a legacy worth fighting for.